Hi, I'm Lydia Lunning.
I'm Morgan McBride.
And I'm Michelle Olivier, and you're listening to Hey, I Want Your Job.
A look behind the curtain at amazing jobs and what it takes to get them.
Good morning and welcome to Hey, I Want Your Job. We've got Glen Campbell with us today. Good morning, Glen. Thanks for joining us. He works in the tech sector, and I'm not going to even try to do more of an intro than that. I'll let him do the talking after that part. So let's start with the really easy part. Glen, what's your job title?
So let's see, I believe the last known one is a senior principal engineer at Dell EMC, but so I'm in the office of the CTO, where we tend to focus on things that are coming down the road. We're meant to look at trends or spot patterns, but I'll be honest, large organizations, of course, are constantly in the middle of reorgs, and I may, in fact, be, officially categorized by HR as like bottle washer or street sweeper. So let's take the, that's right. So let's take the title as a ballpark only.
Okay. So all of the things that you just said about your job, I now have like this mental image of you as like a YouTube cultural influencer, but like within the company. Are you like a YouTube makeup artist for technology within Dell? Is that what you do, Glen?
Well, I'll tell you, you're hitting on certainly an important point, which is the nature of influence. Again, these dynamics, I think, are true in large organizations and small, but I would say particularly so in large organizations that pure sort of titular, pure title-based influence that really doesn't have serious effect unless you're in the top one or two, right? If you're Michael Dell, I think the title matters.
I don't think so. I think you can just say I'm Michael, and I think you're good.
Well,
like Cher,
right.
Right.
There are those with that, my next guest needs no introduction type credentials, but the places where pure title-based influence wanes in terms of its relevance is actually not very far down the ladder at large orgs. So to your point, the nature of influence tends to be a little more, I don't know whether it's fair to call it a meritocracy, but you do get recognized for what you do and what you are capable of doing. And it's that latter one, the capabilities that my team has looked at to broaden and strengthen. So I'll give you an example. There is tremendous amount of value seen in people from my side of so Dell Technologies is the umbrella term for the organization. And then you've got Dell EMC, the infrastructure side. So as my team, myself included, reaches out to other members of different organizations, being able to build those ties that bind, that is actually of more critical importance to the success actually at the individual level and more importantly at the team level. So that influence is around making certain that you have reached out, making certain that those connections are sustained, enriched over time. That's actually a huge portion to whether you succeed or sink.
So when I work with young, hopeful, up-and-coming people, and I've done a lot of graduate recruitment in the past, their impression of that is always the Hollywood version, which is that it involves an inordinate amount of alcohol and posh restaurants and, wild nights out, wining and dining clients. And it's a very glamorous impression of what that looks like. My boots on the ground experience is that it is far less sexy than Hollywood would have us believe. So how do you make those connections lost and how do you make them work?
So you're actually calling out, of course, there is a many-sided die that's being rolled when you're in an organization like this. So that winer diner, party scotch until you fall over, I wouldn't say that is strictly part of the sales dynamic, but I will say, since I've been with the company about a decade, and I will say the critical importance of breaking bread with customers. I think that is universal. I think that is a human condition statement, not a business statement. And so when you look at how do you build success with the customer set, I still think that is absolutely critical. And I don't think that is illegitimate, frankly, in any way. So my own experience through my decade with the company has involved not so much, the drinking. I'm an utter lightweight, but I absolutely respect the unbelievable lift that the sales teams have to go through, have to be able to be willing to do and able to do to bring customer sets into that comfort level to say, do I trust this person I'm speaking with? I probably instinctively trust a fair bit of the portfolio or the business side of it, but that's a secondary decision to, do I trust the human? So, right. So I would say that Hollywood stuff is not wholly untrue. However, when you take it inside a company's four walls, it's certainly far more common. I would say it's a little more staid, a little less lightning bolts, right?
Fewer prostitutes and strip clubs than Hollywood would have us believe.
So
we'll say that that's definitely the party line from Dell.
For sure. So yes, when you're in the machine, I would say that some of the recognition and the savvy as to how to move through the cogs, this becomes a more important talent than, frankly, the whoop it up skill set.
So I think that your point about the breaking bread, I think that's so important because I've worked recruitment and sales. So I've worked in sales forever. And one of the things they always say, that's this tired old trope, which is unfortunately still true, so it keeps getting wheeled out, which is people buy from people. And we hear a lot that the new working universe is never going to go back to being live and in person. We shall hereby always remain on Zoom. And, big tech and the big four and all of them have done a lot of things to actually reinforce that, talking about not renewing leases on workspace and keeping people working from home, etc. What, just from your years of experience, how do you think that's going to shake out in terms of this need to see the whites of their eyes and break bread and be in the same room with somebody? How do you compromise those two?
Well, I'll say I don't know that human nature changes on a dime, and as such, I sometimes think of it. What's the expression? You can teach a donkey to run, but he's never going to win the Kentucky Derby. Right? So I'm quite certain there's a broad skill set that humans have. Throw them in the water, they can swim. The likelihood of us being serious, aquatic, competitive species is effectively nil. Yeah. And in that way, yes, I'm quite certain we not only are adapting, have adapted. The pressures over 2020 are clearly extreme examples of that. However, do I anticipate that as a fundamentally social species, do I anticipate that it's therefore going to be perfectly fine to snip that and make things perennially and solely remote? That seems broken. So when it comes to whether or not we're just a raging group of sickies, there are clearly external pressures. Sure. But I would find it difficult to believe that this is the only way. Now, all of this said, I actually do think it's a complex enough situation where the opportunity to say, I will have a remote employee, which historically has been anathema to many, if not most, organizations. Yeah. I think those walls are breaking down. And this may be a we're masticating, we're chewing on this now, right? And who knows how many ruminating stomachs these organizations have to figure out where they're going to end up. But on balance, am I going to support a remote employee? Frankly, because we're a more attractive organization to them because of that model. I'm expecting some evolution, maybe even some serious revolution to happen there in the next little while.
I think so too. I think that one of the things that I've seen with organizations that have previous to 2020 embraced the remote working culture is that they have everybody's remote, but then they bring them in, and then there's like a unified meeting, and you like once a quarter or once a half year, what have you, where you do break bread and you do have that meeting of the minds and the seeing each other and having that. You can't team bond over Zoom. Just like
right.
you can't customer connect over Zoom. You have to physically be there. So I think that personally, my bet is that we're going to have that kind of a hybrid model, that day ending in Y for like the normal stuff of your job. Unless there's a reason that you have to be in a building, you probably won't be, but that there will be some collectiveness encapsulated in everybody's job, and that will look different between organizations and roles, etc. So I think it's exciting. I'm really excited for what that shift means when we no longer have to live near where we work on a daily basis. I'm excited for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that I've been paying particularly close attention to. So, as we all know, there are different learning types. I happen to be someone who, most people, by the way, can learn in multiple modes. They have preferences and maybe areas where they will accelerate their learning a little more than in others. So, most people are very good visual learners, and for whatever reason, I am not. I find visual learning practically distracting.
Just noise.
It's noise, and that's, I recognize, unfair for me to sort of cast off that model, but I also have to recognize that I will perform poorly, or at least less efficiently. So if you give me a good textbook, that's effectively all I need. If something is read to me, so I will be from a reading learner to an auditory learner, in other words, no visual, that is my next go-to. And then last is the sort of structural class-based pieces, where I find the people around it and the pretty pictures and the balloons and the graphs, I find it annoying and distracting. But I'm calling that out here because, frankly, we are in this space driving to limit some of that model, right? And when you're calling out having that hybrid, I absolutely think that's going to be something that has to be understood. Not just how do I perform, but in a space, certainly mine, and I expect this is true of most, where your ability to learn is actually going to be among the single greatest keys to your perennial success. You might have heard me describe this before. In my world, where in particular, not only in the technology sector overall, but in my specific role on my specific team, I pay attention to what goes on in the open source space, which is this maelstrom of lightning storm activities.
Talk about noise. Right. The open source space is amazingly noisy to me.
And so oddly enough, I actually like that because I'm a pattern-based person. And with those sorts of, sort of shock and bolts all over the place, I can begin to see appropriate patterns. And sort of that space is ultimately saying to me, recognizing how do we take the employees and group them in a way that they begin to recognize, okay, as things change, are you still able to cope? That's probably going to be the biggest indicator for me, how what square we land on.
And I think it's interesting as well to see that at the same time we have this new model that does let us be more adaptive to different learning styles, personalities, etc. We have simultaneously this hyper focus on diversity and inclusion, which for the first time in that dialogue is about more than skin tone. It's also about, because classically diversity and inclusion means, do you have brown people and do you have ladies? And
yes.
And But now we're starting to hear, well, what about neurodivergence? What about, how do you include an autistic perspective on your team? And I think that the increasingly hybrid version of workspace and being able to let people design that makes it easier for non-neurotypicals to be able to be a meaningful part. I think it's going to be really interesting from an HR perspective to see what do we have to do to make people aware that everybody has different ways that they need to work in different environments that they are successful in. And then how do we facilitate that? Because you invest a lot when you hire somebody for the first time. And I think that doing little things that make them suddenly, increase that person's productivity by 30% because you gave them a textbook and didn't make them go to the annoying training class, that's a double cost saving, right? So I think that those types of awareness, as we build those within organizations, I am hopeful, though cautiously optimistic for a change. I think that change is very slow in that kind of space. There's always a lot of resistance. There's always a lot of, but we've always done it this way, by George. And I think that, the good thing about 2020 is it just whammied all of that, right? Like you didn't have a choice but to try something new, because otherwise you were going to do nothing. But I think that it'll be interesting to see how much of that momentum we keep going forward as an economy.
It's funny. You're bringing up, interestingly enough, when I talked about having a chat, one of the things that actually crossed my mind directly relates to kind of your examples there, which is the term spectrum. Right. And I sometimes think of a story I share when I was relatively young, something like 11 or 12. And, it's a black and white world when you're 11 or 12. Right. There is only right and wrong. Like, you're just such a raging imbecile. It's always a total shock to me that any male child lives to adulthood because of the, practically uncountably.
Including your own?
Including, if not particularly my own. But
Okay.
What I sometimes remember is there was a classmate who I really couldn't stand, and just as luck has it, he turned out to be on my hockey team one year. So, you're going through in your head.
Insert here that you're Canadian, and so
Yes,
hockey team is a very different level of social significance.
Indeed. So I should have started the discussion with Zed, Ruth, and about, right? To sort of call that out immediately. But what I had noticed is that, your instant gut reaction to having this person who, you actively didn't like. It isn't simply that you passively didn't care for them. You actively disliked them. And all of a sudden, they're on your hockey team. And I'm shaking my head saying, he was going to be on my line. And I was thinking, this is really just going to be a pain in my petunias. Woe is me. So that's the backdrop. And then ultimately, as we began to play, what I quickly recognized is, wow, this guy is never out of position. So I was a center, he was a right winger. This guy's not only never out of position, but he can take a pass from like crappy passes. And it started to dawn on me, there is more to the black of I can't stand this person, therefore he is universally useless, or white, where I like this person and he is universally useful. There was this dawning on me that says, wait a minute, I actually not only like having this person on my line, I might not want anybody else on my line except somebody like this. So I had that.
Doesn't mean I like him.
And actually, that was the other side of the coin. So, of course, in that classic, you do pillar to post as a child. I go from thinking, what a hateful, despicable, little rotten individual, to all of a sudden, well, maybe he's great. And then, of course, you see him back in school the next day, and you're like, no, I was right the first time. And you net out by saying, I need to recognize, if not at the very least, pay attention to the fact that this person's strengths can be leveraged to the entire team's success. And I can't afford to be a black and white imbecile and just categorize. And I think that term, spectrum, relates to what you've been calling out. How do I configure the circumstances and the people in them to say, this is where we're likely to concoct the best success, cross the greatest amount of ground? And it's all started in my head with this accidental notice. And it sometimes reminds me of what my father said. He said, your weaknesses will bring you far further down than your strengths will raise you up. All I'm telling you is pay attention.
I think that, so again, having worked in recruitment forever, I've listened over and over and over to this whole, we need culture match. They really need to match our corporate culture. And so much of the interview process is about, are they the right culture fit? And really what you mean is, do I like you? And that's such a huge part of the recruitment process. And I think your story is a great example of why it is a terrible thing, really, to be measuring, because it ultimately doesn't matter unless there is something about this person that is toxic to your environment. And there's a difference between toxicity and nonconformity. And if Joan doesn't want to go to the bar with everybody else on a Friday night, she's not toxic in the environment. She just doesn't want to go to the bar on Friday night. And so I think, we need to completely rethink what that means and really stop hiring for culture match, because that just means people like me and people that I like. And at which point you're never going to get anybody that's really different. You're never going to get that great guy whose face you hate, but man, is he good on the hockey field.
And you're kind of calling out, sometimes it's useful to rephrase accepted terms, right? Culture match, which sounds innocuous and frankly might even sound appealing. Reframe it as, oh, you mean the echo chamber.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you can flag the same idea with a slightly more pejorative smell to it, you can kind of knock folks out of that preconceived, it must be good because I like the words I used for it.
So I'm going to redirect us a little bit with we're going to talk more about you and your formative years for half a second. So Bill Gates, Michael Dell, Mark Zuckerberg, Glen Campbell, other than working in IT, what do these men all have in common? None of them have finished a degree. So, as a father and as somebody in a senior position, would you recommend your course to the next generation? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Well, it's interesting. I would, in general, say I wouldn't exactly suggest anybody try and follow the path, but I'll give it a little more color than that. What I would say is I came into things. I'm slightly older than dirt, right? So
you're only slightly older than me, so stop that.
So the barrier to entry for me was effectively no. There was one gate. None. There was one gate. Do you know? And when you walked up to any front door at that time, so this is the late 80s and early 90s, when you walked up to any front door, if you knew, boom, you're in, right? It's like, the Monty Python. Do you hate the Romans? Of course I hate the Romans. How much do you hate the Romans? A lot. Right then, you're in. So, if you showed up hating the Romans a lot, it was in like Flynn. The gate now is far more, it's now running the gauntlet more than just, a single latch on a single gate. Now, however, that said, that sometimes will make it sound like, well, now you need, accreditation out the wazoo. And that's probably more true than I would like to see it, but I'll frame it this way. While yes, accreditation, by the way, this was valuable back in the day when I spent all my time knowing the collateral after the exam, which from an ordinal processing perspective, I can tell you was not the right way.
Well done.
But that model of the challenge that I think people have sometimes missed, or the circumstance that people have sometimes missed, is that they sometimes believe that if you don't know Monday, you therefore, practically by definition, can't know Tuesday. And if there is any sort of card trick that has upended, maybe, shall we say, some detractors or some suspicious people as to whether I should be where I am, it's those who expected on Tuesday for me not to still not know. So they had planned their little chess moves to say, well, I beat Glenn on Monday, I'm going to smoke him on Tuesday. And when ultimately on Tuesday, I've recognized that, there was a pattern.
Exam, so now you understood it.
This is exactly it. So I spend the Tuesday morning reading the 1,000-page textbook that I should have read 6 months before Tuesday. And all of a sudden, they recognize, wait a minute, having game, that's a critical skill. And what just showed up on Tuesday was someone who already had game, and now they have material. So that. Yeah, long story just to say, I would absolutely never underestimate the value of that appropriate accreditation. That said, the world I think we're moving into, and this is, I think, valuable, is that it's no longer just STEM. So you had mentioned, no longer just, male or female. Some of those things are a little more analog, a little less binary. So I think the spectrum as to who should be, even in my own space, I think that is legitimately widening. And therefore, the path to quote unquote where I am, I think it can come to it from a person who started in biology. My 4 years in university, despite being an academic, not glorious, non-illustrious time, I would say that the fact that I spent it in evolutionary biology and medical anthropology, those things sound like they're totally unrelated, but they're not. That is a study of large-scale distributed systems, which directly
I'm a liberal arts girl all the way, so I completely believe that the whole value in a degree is teaching you how to learn, and that the details are relatively immaterial. So, but I have degrees in international law and Russian with a minor in comparative lit from a bougie liberal arts school. So obviously I'm exceedingly biased on that front. I think it's really interesting what you're talking about, because we're seeing at the same time a decline of those traditional educational institutions and a rejection from the up and coming sort of generations, that they don't see the value, that the price tag, the juice isn't worth the squeeze from a price perspective. And I get asked a lot, well, I've got these 3 pieces of paper, isn't that going to help? And I have a huge bias that says, no, those pieces of paper were not worth your life. Those are stupid. But I am not, as it turns out, a hiring manager in the IT space. Are there, am I wrong? Are there pieces of paper that they can get in lieu of a traditional 4-year degree that you would either rather see or would weight as highly as that? So there's this one that's a A+ certification thing that we see a lot. And then there's a few others. Obviously, once you get to the higher levels and you're getting like, your CSM, that's a different level of professional standard. But a baseline knowledge, are there any of the pieces of paper that you would rank as being useful?
So the accreditation, when it comes to professional accreditation, I may be an outside-in person on this. I wanted to quickly comment when you had highlighted the juice and the squeeze. I'll take a bit of an outside-in sort of, or make an outside-in comment. That the affordability of higher education is an unfortunately disproportionate circumstance domestically here. That barrier is truly not quite the same thing in many, if not most, parts of the rest of the globe.
Yeah.
So now it's not a unique statement. There's tremendously competitive models we know of lots. The Indian subcontinent. There's a variety of those as well. But I'm trying to call out that it is not ubiquitous. And when it comes to the accessibility of higher education, if ultimately it's measured as juice and squeeze in one region, it would be worthwhile to recognize, wait a minute, this is not such a big problem. The juice and squeeze is not only valuable, but absolutely valuable, practically a no-brainer in many, if not most, other geographies.
Yeah.
You have a competitiveness negative pressure that's going to result in. So broad statement there. But so far as the professional accreditation, that's, I would say, if this is the sole option left to you, what that might be doing is that you're not going to be leapfrogging into, I think, the big leagues.
Management fast track. Yeah.
Well, and for that matter, management, that's again a very useful discussion, whether or not there is a preponderance or a known ratio or an evolving ratio for those in STEM. Historically, there is a reticence for those in STEM to look at management. This is just ratios. That's not an absolute.
No, yeah.
And right, that idea of saying, if I go from knowing how to do it to telling others, please go do it. This feels like I need to turn into a different person. So I don't know how true this is, frankly, of spaces outside of my direct experience. Maybe this is broadly true, maybe it isn't. But this concept of military modeling, which is how most North American organizations are, right? You're the plebe, right?
You're really good at this, so you must be really great at telling people how to do this. Yeah.
Oh yes, I mean the very nature of the Peter Principle itself, right? Promote until you're categorically useless. This I think this is certainly broadly true. However, what I'm kind of calling out is the path through. Should people choose whether it's A+, and I would say that's on the fine list. We talked earlier about understanding the individual and the spectrum and where they can contribute. I would say one of the measuring sticks for me, and maybe I should preface that as saying, having run IT groups at every organization I've ever worked for, other than where I've been for the last decade, because the work is so interesting, I get to stay and be an individual on a team. This is also quite new. No longer must I spend all my time with the team. I can spend a huge amount of my time doing solo work and coordinating where required, not strictly by mandate or necessarily purely by design. So that's kind of where I've stayed. However, having been a hiring manager for, frankly, the majority of my life, the question I've always asked as I'm looking through the resume, if I can distill it from there or have the conversation with a candidate, is I usually use the term, what's in your black doctor bag? In other words, what magic tricks have you been collecting? This is, by the way, something that purely pivots on curiosity alone, because the pieces that are in anyone's individual doctor bag can be broad. They should have some base, but there should be some uniqueness there, and that's the tell. So am I going to look at it as A+, or am I going to look at it as a double E or a CE or a CS? Am I going to look at those as definitive? They're information. In the same way we were talking earlier, no natural instinct is absolutely bad or good. Yes, you've got traits that are broadly negative and traits that are broadly positive. This is true, but it's not an absolute, right? I had a big, loudmouth, mostly ignoramus person in high school. However, and he was mostly like just, a problem. Whatever circumstance you were in, you added him and it got worse, right? But big, burly guy, And sometimes when fisticuffs came out, this guy stepped in and just made mincemeat of people. So you kind of recognize that periodically,
a useful tool.
Periodically, the meathead who turns others into mincemeat is exactly useful. So, so his little doctor bag was not what I would call rich. But when I was doing interviewing, I was trying to assess what's in your doctor bag. What have you learned? Are you curious? Is there long-standing evidence of this, et cetera, et cetera? I have found those things more relevant. Now, in my space at the moment, do I think someone with an A+ is going to jump into the fast lane? I have to be honest, no. However, the last bastion of absolute meritocracy is coding. If you're some, unwashed, overly ripe smelling individual from the basement, as the cliche goes.
Right.
But
that's what Hollywood tells us they all are. Yeah, absolutely.
That's what Hollywood tells. That's right. That's right. But if you have rippingly good coding skills, which by the way are increasingly social, in other words, you can make that code public. You can contribute to projects, which by the way also tells you inclinations, ability to work with others, et cetera, et cetera. If that's something that you do, that's an inoculant to people saying, I don't like what the piece of paper says.
So I think it's really interesting that all of that, because a huge part of what we get from erstwhile up and coming coders in particular is these like 15-page resumes where they copy pasted every job duty that they have ever had, trying to show this overflowing black doctor's bag. And what we have to say is that does not do the thing you think it does. That, when you tell me I am a Java coder for a financial company, I have a really good idea of what you do on the daily. I do not need you to tell me the details of what that is. What I'm interested on in a resume is, what did you do that was exceptional? And why should I believe that you were a particularly good iteration of that thing? And I think that what I really recommend to those folks is that GitHub is basically an essential application tool these days for exactly what you're talking about, because that's how you show this is the code that I created. This is a project that I was a part of, and it is an innately social tool. It is an innately, I can actually see the thing and kind of measure what you are. And it gives a little more personality than a very formal business document like a resume. We still don't want your photograph on the resume. No, you can't have it in purple. Comic Sans is still a terrible idea. All of that. But if you want a purple GitHub, go big, like whatever. And I think that GitHub, for me at least, I think that does a lot of what you're talking about there.
You've hit it right on the head. And I guess what I would say is you're absolutely correct. As opposed to walking in with your, nicely weathered leather doctor bag and unclasp it and start dumping all of the implements onto the desk saying, no, that's a scalpel, don't touch that crap, right? As opposed to that model where, as you're saying, you've listed every tool you have, ultimately highlighting that you have a very nice doctor bag is a start, and people can loosely interpret that you probably have some pretty good knives inside. And it then comes back into saying, well, all right, were you the cardiovascular surgeon who wears a helmet that says Maverick, right, on it, and do you actually think you're like a 2 foot taller version of Tom Cruise? Or instead, did I see that you initially, when you joined teams, did you write code tests, the DREC, the structure, the think of it like the wiring harnesses of the world? Did you write documentation? Which, by the way,
are you the documentation guy? Because that's the guy. Coders never want to document, and there's like one in every team that is the documentation guy.
Well, sure. And actually, there's a bunch of things that you can intuit from that, which is to say, A, the person will go do the hard stuff and the lumpy stuff, and the not glorious stuff. Okay, important. But if they simply stayed there, which by the way is not a knock, then you say, okay, you're a technical writer. That's a different thing. If, however, you said, I'm going to join this effort by doing the dreck, by carrying water, and then you then saw 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months later, that you had ultimately been responsible for some of the most critical user stories put in the latest backlog for a release. This is what you're looking for from those particulars.
So we have not yet discussed the super gauche question that we always have to ask. Because everybody wants to know. I do not expect you to actually answer, but the question is, of course, how much do you make? How do you respond when people ask that?
Well, most of the time when you've had those interviews when you are the interviewing person being interviewed, sometimes you simply respond with, wouldn't you like to know?
I think
right?
That's fine.
But here's where, it's clearly not an illegitimate question, despite the fact that, as you're mentioning, no one's going to, I shouldn't say no one. Some people may blurt it out.
We have had a guest who was just like, I make $80,000 plus commission. And he had zero qualms with just shouting to the world exactly what he made. By far the exception.
By far the exception. And in that same way that what you recognize is that this is a drive to see how far on the poles of the stick are we, right? Is one person yelling from the north and the other person yelling from the Antarctic? Have we continents between us? And frankly, the response, whether numerical or euphemistic, that actually tells you a tremendous amount in and of itself, which might, in a purely actuarial science perspective, appear to tell you nothing, but it doesn't. Of course, it tells you a tremendous amount. Now, let's be honest: the technology sector has been extremely fortunate to be lucrative. And I don't frankly see a sector or a space where technology is not applying such critical contributions that I'm anticipating that falling off the table edge. Oh, well, no, I don't need anybody with technology expertise, right? I need someone who can bang rocks together to make fire, right? This is not happening. So what we
really need is a good typist. Where can they find?
Yes.
Or somebody with great handwriting. What has happened to great handwriting?
So we have an Olivetti back there, right? Smith Corona. And actually the Smith Corona we have has that little overwrite cartridge with the white. So you have to type over in the same incorrect letters you typed the first time. So yeah.
I am consistently impressed that whiteout continues to have a market. Like, I feel like the delete button on in every word processing program ever is,
I think whiteout is probably more for the olfactory impact.
It's just, at this point, it is just accepted socially that it is nothing more than a cheap high for high school kids.
That's exactly right.
I did use it for nail polish in high school as well, because goth phase, But of course, as one does.
Black, white. What else is there?
From the ages of 14 to 18, I believe that is exactly what my wardrobe said. Occasionally some burgundy, like blood, because.
Oh, yes. And, the other nice thing about the uniform is that you begin to say, I have cottoned on to this idea that there is only two groups. There is an us and there is a them. Right. And the best way for me to figure out the them, because I'm clearly too young and, at least personally speaking, too abjectly stupid to determine any other way, I'm going to wear the uniform. And if yours isn't the same as mine, clever Charles here will figure it out.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Glenn. It has been a delight, and I think you've been super informative for everybody. If anybody wants to know more about Glenn, we'll have links to him on the notes for the show, and you can check out his LinkedIn page. And if you need any help with interview prep or resumes and helping do the things that Glenn suggested, we are always available to do that at ONH. Thank you so much.
Michelle, it's been fabulous. Thanks.
You've been listening to Hey, I Want Your Job.
For more on how you can get your own awesome job, visit ONH Consulting at www.onhconsulting.com. We offer incredible resumes, no-nonsense career advice, and real-world tips for landing a job in today's market. Check us out on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for more insider info. Soon you'll be hearing us say,
I'm Morgan McBride, and I want your job.
and I'm Lydia Lunning, and I want your job.
And I'm Michelle Olivier. And hey, I want your job.